Remember this PC from a few videos ago? I want to know if we can have AI troubleshoot some of its issues. We're going to try to stump it. And if we can't, well, I guess I should just quit here and now. This might be the last video I make. In all seriousness, I just want to see how well AI can handle this. It's gonna probably do quite well, if I had to guess, and we're just gonna use ChatGPT 4.0. I'm gonna give it the role of a PC technician, and we're gonna have it recommend to us things we should be doing as the hands-on PC repair person. We're gonna see how long it takes, maybe just via the number of questions we ask it, the number of prompts that it returns, for it to fix the issue. We're gonna run 3 different scenarios. We're gonna start with an easy case, and then we're gonna work our way to a very difficult one, or what I would regard as a fairly difficult issue. These are all going to be hardware related, so they will involve things that we can readily swap out and replace. I expect that's what it'll have us do, is start part swapping early on. Then again, I've never actually checked this ahead of time. I have no idea if ChatGPT is even going to be good at this. It might be awful, in which case I think it would still make for an entertaining video. But if it does do well, yeah, then I'm seriously at risk of losing my job. Anyway, let's get to it then. Stay with me. The Antec Performance 1 FT is a resourceful take on a modern full tower PC case with plenty of cable management headroom, ample hardware support, and extra goodies like an integrated temperature display. Installation is easy thanks to removable brackets for up to 360mm radiators up top and a big chungus 420mm at the front. And if you're worried about long-term cooling performance, a perforated and accented front panel pairs nicely with 4, that's right, 4 Antec Storm T3 fans, each 30mm thick with PWM support. And the 3 up front, mind you, are 140s. The Performance 1 FT is ready for your next PC build and the latest generation of hardware. Be sure to click the links below to learn more. So here is the game plan. Starting with this rig behind me, we're gonna power it on just so I can show you that everything works as intended out of the box. This will be our control. Then I'm gonna manipulate one aspect of the rig, something hardware related, to prevent it from either posting or powering on. Then we'll swing on over to OpenAI. I'll give it a prompt, I'll give it a scenario, I'll tell it that it's in charge of PC repair and that it needs to relay any recommendations to me, the hands-on repair technician. So I'll just be doing whatever it tells me in an effort to get this rig back up and running. We'll do this 3 different times. And like I said, with each subsequent test, we'll try to make things a bit more difficult. Each time, it's gonna be a little harder to figure out what's wrong with the rig. First things first, here's everything powered on. You can see this here's a post, sorry about the glare. This would normally boot into Windows by this point or into the BIOS. The fact is, it does power on, it does send a signal to the monitor. This rig is healthy to begin with. By the way, the CPU fan error is probably one of the reasons why it's splashing here, not into the BIOS, because we don't have an operating system in the storage drive of this rig, but this is a very quick fix. You can hop into the BIOS and disable this header altogether, or just simply plug a fan into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. And now it's time to break something in this rig. All we're gonna do is take one of the DRAM modules and slightly dislodge it from the slot. This is actually something that we see quite a bit in the Fix or Flop playlist. It's a very common issue, especially for first-time builders. They don't realize how much force they need to apply to get a DIMM all the way inserted, and so that's what we're gonna try to replicate here. So now from the side, both DIMMs still look straight, but you'll notice at the very top there, that left tab is not pushed all the way in, and if we get further to the left here, further to the right, you'll see that that DIMM is actually not slotted all the way in. So when we attempt to power this rig on, we shouldn't this time get a post. If we do, well, that's some weird juju. And would you look at that, power on at the rig, but no post. And this symptom actually carries through a ton of different hardware issues. So it's not just not seating RAM all the way, you could have a number of things wrong with your rig that cause this. And I chose this rig to kind of run these scenarios with intentionally. There's no Dr. Debug LED baked into this motherboard. There aren't even basic debug LEDs on this board. So you're kind of shooting in the dark here. You could connect a speaker, maybe you hear some beeps, although in a lot of cases, I don't hear beeps for symptoms like this. So you're kind of just left to your own devices, or in this case, ChatGPT. We're going to be using ChatGPT 4 for the entirety of this video, by the way. You could use ChatGPT 3.5, though I think 4 puts us in a slightly better position to have these rigs actually fixed. I gave it a basic prompt. I said, you're a PC repair technician. Your job is to troubleshoot defective computers and suggest solutions and hardware to test. Your feedback will be used to diagnose real-world issues by a hands-on tech in the office. And that, of course, is yours truly. The response I got, it is so weird that we get responses like this, just like totally AI generated, but you can see it sounds like a real human. This is actually something that I could see myself saying to somebody. Could you please describe the issue with the computer that needs to be resolved? Please be as detailed as possible about what's happening, any error messages you've seen, or any other symptoms the computer is showing. And this is super important for troubleshooting. The more context, the better. And now for the first scenario. I tell it that for this first PC, it turns on but does not post or send a picture to a monitor. All the fans are spinning. I've looked over the rig and I don't see any vital hardware missing. That last sentence was a bit of an Easter egg for it, but you can see that it very quickly spit out a series of things to check. And I'm going to try to narrow this down for the next two tests. But you'll notice that it tells us to check the power supply first, then make sure that the monitor works, then check the display cables, and then remove and reinsert the RAM. Sometimes the system can fail to post if the RAM is not properly seated. So literally the fourth suggestion, which is the first real thing to test apart from maybe the power supply. I wouldn't jump straight to the PSU just because the rig does appear to be functioning. It is turning on, fans are spinning, etc. The fact that it recommended RAM for the fourth thing is pretty darn impressive. And I think it's inferring just from research it's conducted online, maybe in the background or in the past, that RAM is, again, a frequent issue, especially for first-time builders. Being able to slot it in correctly, feeling like maybe you're breaking something in the process, can cause these no-post issues like the one we just simulated. So I'll admit, this first scenario was a bit of a gimme, right? I mean, it didn't really do anything that impressive. It just listed a bunch of things that any basic hardware troubleshooter would check, presumably in this order or in some order similar to this one. I think I've come up with something here that will stump ChatGPT, at least for the first few responses. We're gonna swap the power switch pins with the power LED pins. Not the pins themselves, but the cables. So this will prevent the system from outright powering on at all. We shouldn't get any signs of life from the rig. So yeah, now, on the surface at least, this thing appears dead as a box of rocks, which is just perfect. Now this one turned out to be much more interesting. I first told it that another PC arrived in the office and it does not power on at all. I then told it that I'd like it to recommend one thing to check or test at a time. Please make an effort to hone in on the issue at hand as quickly as possible without missing anything obvious. Time is of the essence. Thank you. It just feels weird to be mean or rude or like abrupt, like with no emotion to an AI, when like in theory I guess the AI doesn't really know what emotion is either, so when it responds to you it's very blasé. But even if I'm talking to a robot, I feel like I need to be somewhat courteous. So of course, ChatGPT 4 obliged. It said, absolutely, let's troubleshoot this systematically. That's good to see. Step 1, it says check the power supply. First thing to verify is if the power source is working properly, check the power cable, and then check the power button. Now I thought right away it was gonna figure out what was wrong here, but all it told us to check, if you read this thoroughly, was the power button physically itself. It says sometimes the button can get stuck or stop functioning correctly. Make sure it's not stuck and is moving freely when pressed. I then responded that I tested both the power supply and the physical button on the case. Both are working properly. Step number 2 involved inspecting the PSU itself. It wanted us to use a PSU tester if we had one, and we do use one quite frequently in Fix or Flop. Or if we didn't have a tester, it told us to use the quote-unquote paperclip test, which I think is kind of funny that it even knows what this is. It's obvious that it's, you know, pulling this information likely from forums or just from websites with authority, but it is still cool that it even knows what this is and gives us a few different ways of setting this test up to see whether or not the power supply is responsive. I was also a bit worried that it was just going to keep spitting off the same order of operations that it did in scenario 1 with that big list it gave us. However, I think starting with the power supply in this case makes a lot of sense because we told it the rig was not responsive at all. There was no sign of life coming from the PC. So I responded, my power supply tester reports the unit was fine. I've also tested it in another rig without issue. And then it responded, great, we can rule out the power supply then. It's taking my word for it. Obviously it knows that it can't physically test these things. It's just relying on my input. Now step 3 was where I was let down a bit because it immediately told us to jump into the motherboard and CPU. And this is where I realized that it was actually not giving us the same spiel that it gave us in scenario 1. This order is definitely different. And what I'll often do in Fix or Flop is save the motherboard and CPU for last because these are two of the more labor-intensive, time-consuming things to check. It didn't mention anything about checking the pins either in the socket or underneath the chip itself. It didn't ask if this was an AM4 or AM5 chip or if it was an LGA motherboard we were dealing with. So it didn't ask for any of that context. It just asked us to check that the CPU is seated correctly, which I don't know. I feel like it could have been a bit more detailed there, or maybe better yet, just save this part for later. So I told it the motherboard and CPU have been checked in separate systems, both work without issue, and that the 8-pin is also connected correctly. It says, thanks for checking those components. Since they're functioning in other systems, we can rule them out as well. Then it tells us in step 4 to test the RAM. And this one's pretty straightforward. Just make sure RAM's seated correctly. If you have multiple sticks, try booting in the system with just one stick at a time, and then maybe try the RAM in another system if possible. I quickly tell it that RAM is not the issue, and then we roll into step 5, where it tells us to check the case power switch. I'm impressed that it got here in only 5 prompts. However, I feel like just the logical order of things should have dictated that step 5 come after step 2 involving the power supply unit itself. So here it tells us that although we've tested the power button before, it's possible that the power switch connection to the motherboard might be faulty or not connected properly. 1, locate the power switch header on your motherboard. This is typically a pair of pins in the block of front panel connections. 2, disconnect the power switch connector from the motherboard. 3, use a screwdriver to carefully bridge the 2 power switch pins on the motherboard. So it's effectively asking us to bypass the power switch cables, and we've actually run into this very issue before in Fix or Flop, where a user's case just had either a faulty switch, a faulty cable, or the switch itself did appear to be physically okay, but there was some sort of short on the board that either kept the switch open or closed permanently. And this, of course, was bingo. I'm making sure to tell it when it does something correctly because I want it to use this context for future scenarios. I said that jumping the power pins on the motherboard worked and the PC powered up normally. The power switch connector was crossed with the power LED wires. Essentially, these wires were plugged into the opposing headers on the board, the opposing pins, and swapping these back around fixed our problem. GPT-4 then responded, fantastic, glad we could find the root of the issue. It seems like a simple wiring mistake was causing the problem. Make sure to connect the power switch connector to the proper pins on the motherboard to ensure the power button works correctly in the future. These kinds of issues can be hard to spot, but they're usually fairly easy to fix once identified. Thank you for your patience throughout this process. If you have any other computers or issues that you need help with, don't hesitate to ask. Happy troubleshooting. Again, I could just picture myself saying these things. It's so weird talking to an AI, knowing full well there's not like a legit human on the other side saying these things. So we'll fix that and then power the system back on. And would you look at there? Power on and well, hopefully a post. If not, I'm gonna look pretty silly here. So we managed to, I don't think we really stumped it, but you know, we did kind of reveal that its order of operations is a little odd. So it's possible that ChatGPT just doesn't have a real concept of like time. Like it's maybe not accounting for how long it takes to test some of the things it tells us to test. And if it did account for those, it might change the order of recommendation. But other than that, it did eventually figure out what was wrong. And I think 5 steps in is not the end of the world. Now for scenario number 3. What are we gonna do that's more complicated than what we just did to try to stump it? Now, I'll be honest, this one was a bit of a stretch. I get it. If I receive any flack in the comments, so be it. But I was really looking for specifics with this one. And I think that's important, especially for anyone trying to work on, especially their own rig, who maybe doesn't have a ton of troubleshooting experience. I told it that another PC arrived in the office. This one powered on without issue. However, after around 5 minutes or so of idling in the BIOS, the system would turn back off. And then the issue could be immediately replicated over and over. Now, right away, to GPT-4's credit, it assumed that the computer was overheating. This was, in fact, the case. It told us that we should go into the BIOS and look at temperatures. It said if temperatures were exceeding a certain degree, it said 90 to 100 C, but frankly, even that's a bit high for what I would deem as overheating, quote unquote, in a BIOS, that it was likely just shutting down to save itself from further damage, and that we should look into the cause of overheating if this was the case. So I told it, yes, you are correct. The CPU is running very hot in the BIOS. How might we address this? And GPT-4 resorted straight to checking the cooling system. It says check the CPU fan first, make sure that it's spinning, and then check the CPU cooler itself. Now this is where I was really looking for specifics because obviously, based on what we did here by leaving the plastic on, obviously there's not good contact if there's plastic still applied. And if ChatGPT was making the assumption that it probably is about me being somewhat experienced in PC repair, it would just assume that I knew to remove that. However, it didn't explicitly say anything about plastic being on the cold plate, and almost every cooler that you'll buy on Amazon or Newegg or in stores has such a plastic piece that you need to remove. So it's not like a random one-off thing that only some coolers have. It's very common, and I would expect it to know that it would be a part of this installation, that it would need to be removed prior to having thermal paste applied. It then told me to check PC case ventilation. This would be a logical check. Yeah, if you're running a hot box, I mean, that could result in some degree of overheating, although I don't imagine it'd be this extreme unless it was in a completely sealed environment. It then told us to check BIOS settings. Again, another logical ask if you have too much voltage being pumped to the chip or just some other setting that you're not aware of. It then told us to check the power supply. Sometimes a faulty power supply apparently can cause overheating, though I've never run into this issue myself. Then it told us to check for hardware compatibility. It says that with certain boards without a BIOS update, sometimes the chip in question can overheat. Again, I've never seen that, but I've seen much weirder, so not the craziest of assumptions. Then on step 7, it tells us to test the CPU in a different system. And here's where we start to come full circle. I tell it that the chip runs perfectly fine in a different rig with a different cooler. And its response is important. It says, great, thanks for following through. Since the CPU works fine in another system with a different cooler, this suggests the problem could be with the current cooler or the motherboard. The motherboard is a bit more far-fetched, but again, it's starting to, I think, learn a bit more about the situation. It first tells us to test the cooler in a different system. If the CPU in question starts overheating in that system, it suggests the cooler might be defective or insufficient for the CPU. These other two are, well, a bit less relevant. It says inspect the motherboard for damage and then check the cooler compatibility. This could be an issue, but I very quickly let it know that the cooler is compatible with the socket. And in my response, I tossed it a bit of an Easter egg. I said that I was sure to clean the thermal paste from the plastic underneath the CPU cooler each time, but it results in higher temperatures regardless of the system in which it is used. So I mentioned plastic there, and I expect ChatGPT to realize that plastic is not a great thermal conductor, and so this would throw some red flags, and sure enough, it did. It said the key detail in your message is about cleaning the thermal paste from the plastic underneath the CPU cooler. Typically, thermal paste is applied between the CPU heat spreader, the top part of the CPU, and the bottom of the CPU cooler, not underneath the cooler. It then tries to confirm where the thermal paste is being applied. Ensure it's applied in a small pea-sized amount directly on the center of the CPU heat spreader, not underneath the CPU cooler or on any plastic parts. I then said there's a piece of plastic on the bottom of the CPU tower cooler. This is what I was referring to, just trying to kind of zone it in on the correct thing. And then it says, I see, thank you for the clarification. Generally, CPU coolers have a protective plastic cover. There we go, bingo. Or sticker on the bottom to keep the surface clean and scratch-free during transportation. This plastic cover must be removed before installation. The purpose of thermal paste is to improve the thermal contact between the CPU and the metal base of the cooler, so having plastic in the way would definitely cause overheating. I then love this last sentence after it tells us how to fix the issue. It says, check the CPU temperatures after performing these steps and let me know the results. This might well be the source of the issue. It's like trying to beat itself up now, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed this. This sounds like we're on the money now. Like we've hit the target dead on. And while at this point, I'm sure many of you are beating me up for being way too harsh on this thing. Oh, it got it right in step 2. Why are you being so critical with this? I think it's important to be specific about what the cause is, because remember, ChatGPT is learning. Everything you feed it, all the information you give it, especially these circumstantial kind of just makeshift scenarios, can help improve its responses in the future. So if someone else wanted to troubleshoot and ran into the same issue where they forgot maybe to remove the plastic cover, maybe now, since we've pointed out that this is something that people run into from time to time, maybe now OpenAI will be quicker at mentioning the possibility of plastic still being there. So at the very least, we're probably still somewhat training the thing. So we put up with it a bit and we were a bit harsh, but for the greater good. Build better and smarter with the Corsair iQ Link ecosystem, a leap forward in PC building aimed at reducing cable clutter and maximizing hardware compatibility. Run a single controller with the iQ System Hub and manage all of your RGB devices through revamped software. The hub fits almost anywhere in your case and allows for up to 7 connected devices in a single cable design spanning across fans, coolers, power supplies, cases, and more from Corsair. Click the link below to learn more. So depending on who you ask, I think ChatGPT 4 did a fine job at troubleshooting this rig. The 3 different scenarios were hardware related. That obviously does play a role in this. I think it would struggle a bit more with software, especially intermittent software issues. And even I tend to stay away from those because they're just so spotty. And frankly, they don't look as sexy on camera. So what do you think? Did ChatGPT 4 do a good job? I think it did, again, but that's just my impression. Would I be comfortable hiring ChatGPT as my troubleshooting consultant? For hardware, I definitely would be. I'd be a bit hesitant to use it from like a time value perspective. I think it might send me down some rabbit holes I didn't really need to be down to begin with. But I'm not really all that shocked that it knows and is familiar with a lot of the basic hardware troubleshooting steps. We did sort of pull its leg a bit for scenario number 3. Scenario number 2, it took maybe a bit longer than it needed to, and for scenario number 1, it was pretty much on the money. Just kind of spitting off some of the basic troubleshooting steps that anybody in my position would run through to begin with. It did mention, I think at one point as well, clearing the CMOS, so that really didn't come up after that. And I think that that's an important note. It probably noticed based on the symptoms that it didn't sound like some sort of BIOS conflict or software issue, especially in the cases where the system wasn't powering on. So scenario number 2, and then scenario number 3, where it powered on and then would randomly shut off. I mean, it knew right away it was a thermal issue. It didn't do as good a job as I expected, or it wasn't specific enough with regard to how to fix the overheating. And maybe the plastic peel thing is just not that common. So it assumed that I should have known better, or it just doesn't come up in the real world very much. But the fact is, it has before. We've seen it come up in the Fix or Flop playlist before. So maybe now it'll be a bit quicker about mentioning plastic in the future. It's just one random use case, but the more we use it as a collective industry, I think the better it'll be at helping other folks in the future. If you enjoyed this one, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to support us on Patreon, you can do so via the link below. Consider joining our public Discord server. That's totally free of charge. And I will catch you in the next one. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.